City University Television presents the American Theater Wing Seminars. Working in the theater. This seminar, production.
Welcome to the American Theater Wing's Working in the Theater Seminars, now in their 30th year, coming to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Today's seminar is devoted to the production of the Broadway musical, Thoroughly Modern Millie. With the members of its creative and production teams, we will follow this show from its beginning as a work for the stage through to the current production now on Broadway. I'm Isabel Stevenson, Chairman of the Board of the American Theater Wing, and now with great pleasure, let me introduce our moderator for the seminar, Roy A. Seminar, a veteran producer and President of the American Theater Wing. Roy.
Thank you, Isabel. We're delighted to be here to dissect Thoroughly Modern Millie and find out why it became such a hit. So let me introduce our panel if I can. On my far right is Rob Ashford, the choreographer. Next to him is Janine Tesori, who is did the music for the show. Dick Scanlon, who wrote the lyrics and the book. And left is Hal Luftig, a producer of the show. Nina Lannon, the general manager. And Michael Mayer, the director. Now, these are the people who really made the show what it is today. So what we'd like to do is trace the history of the show. What happened from the kernel of an idea through the marketing of it today. So I think I'll start with you, Dick. I think you have the deepest roots in Thoroughly Modern Millie. How did it come about?
Well, I got the idea very early on in my writing career. I was actually just beginning to write, and I had seen the movie sort of a few times in a short amount of time, and I had been struck by how idiosyncratic the characters were, that they were not stock characters, that the writer at work, who turned out to be the film writer Richard Morris, had a really wonderful, delicious sense of language, and mostly by the fact that the three young people in the story, Millie, Jimmy, and Miss Dorothy, all had the same objective, and I found it to be a profound one, and that was that they were on a gut level very dissatisfied and unhappy with the life that they were fated to live, with their lot in life, for varying reasons. And they set about to change that. And I thought that was a big idea that I really related to, because that's what brought me to New York City, and that was sort of the story of my young days.
And when was this that you
This was in the late 80s. And at that time, since I had, just begun writing, I instantly knew, Hal, that it would be a $10 million musical. I didn't think anybody would say, hey, unknown, unpublished, untried writer, of course we're going to let you do this. So I set about writing many, many other things, and I wrote, and began to accumulate a lot of publication and whatnot, and finally I completed a novel that I'd been working on for some time, and this idea never went away. It just was always there with me.
Was this before there was a trend to take Hollywood movies and turn them into Broadway musicals?
Well, it was 1988, so I guess the answer would be no. And I think the answer to that, it's certainly nothing like it is today. And again, it was never about, this movie and the way the movie chooses to tell its story should be put on stage. It was that the story and the characters I thought were stage-worthy. And from the beginning, I had the sense that the stage version could be reimagined in many, many ways to make it theatrical. And one of the things that attracted to me is that the movie, unlike, say, Singin' in the Rain, which had already been, there'd been a Broadway adaptation, the movie Thoroughly Modern Millie isn't a classic. It's by nobody's definition, including Richard Morris, who wrote it, a great movie. It's got charm, it's got some kick to it, but there's many criticisms could be leveled at it, and I actually thought that was a good thing because I thought it was an opportunity to take the story and make it even tighter and better and more effective and more what I thought it wanted to be.
It wasn't a successful movie, would you say?
It was actually financially enormously successful, and that was because it starred Julie Andrews, who at that time was the #1 box office star in the world. It rescued Universal from bankruptcy that year. Every year, every year Universal seemed to be on the verge, and every year a movie came out that rescued it, and Thoroughly Modern Millie was the movie that year. So it did enormous numbers, but it didn't have much of an afterlife. It's not a movie that has lived on, except, in sort of a cult way. So that's how it began, and then at a certain point I decided to pursue the rights, which, very fortunately for all of us, Richard Morris had the foresight to retain. And I say fortunately because movie companies are very difficult to get anything out of, whereas individuals are easier to approach. And though Richard was initially exceedingly unreceptive to my advances, he was the most curmudgeonly and turned out to be the sweetest man I've ever known. But initially I would call him and say, I'd prepare my little speech and I'd have it in front of me and I'd say it and I'd finish and I'd say, blah, blah, blah. So I'd really like to adapt Thoroughly Modern Millie for the stage. He'd say, no, click. And this went on for a long period of time until finally I basically showed up at his doorstep. And we discovered that we were fated to be collaborators and pals. He was a 6'2" Irishman named Dick, and we were very, very, in the moment we met, it was just sort of simpatico, and that's when the writing began.
Well, I'm going to interrupt the story for a moment. Do you find him today as audacious as he was at the time he went to see Richard Morris?
Dick Scanlon?
Yes.
Totally. Totally, which is how we got to a $10 million.
Well, Michael, the same way, this is a very bold move for somebody who's never written a musical.
Well, I've known Dick since 1978 when we were kids together in a summer production of West Side Story.
A 6-year-old kids together.
So his exuberance has been maintained wonderfully through the years. So this is the same person that I knew then.
Right, and so now you've gotten Richard Morris.
Yes,
keeping the Dick and the Richard separate.
Everybody called him Dick, and the only reason I called him Richard is because he said, "Honey, it's going to be very confusing to have two people named Dick in the room." He put it slightly differently, but so we called him Richard and me Dick, and that made it easier.
And he passed away.
He passed away in April of '96, and he, unbeknownst to me, by the time I got to him in 1993, by the time he finally let me, the stalker, into his house, he had been diagnosed with cancer, which he didn't reveal to me for some time. And he was, I don't know why, but it was something that he was kept very private. And he would live to see the very initial draft of the book completed and to give me sort of marching orders and instructions and, most importantly, permission to change whatever needed to be changed in order to make this a sturdy, funny, moving, and true stage vehicle. That's what he cared about.
Back to the story.
Yeah.
You drafted then a script. And at what time did you decide that, you knew that always it was going to be a musical, at what time did you decide who would do the music for it? Who would you be a collaborator there?
That was in 1997. We had, Michael and I had done a reading of it, Michael directing it, using existing music that had some new lyrics written by me, and we were pleased with the way the story was unfolding and very dissatisfied with the way the existing music was serving us. And it's called a musical, and we felt that the music was lacking and didn't have the singularity sort of a voice we wanted. So we thought, well, let's get a composer on here and Janine had written Violet, which I had seen and loved, and Michael had done some work with Janine on another project, and he, in addition to her incredible gift as a composer, as a woman, he admired her ferocity and her passion and her tremendous intelligence, and I think saw in her sort of a Millie figure and thought, well, wouldn't it be great to have one of the writers be a Millie,
Right.
you know? And so we called her, and she was, you know, holding basically a 2-hour-old baby, you know, and she said, well, maybe not this week, but really soon. And that's when it began. That's
Well, the original music from the film was all by Sammy Kahn and...
It was actually, there were
Really?
2 songs in the movie by Sammy Kahn and James Van Heusen, Thoroughly Modern Millie and a song called The Tapioca. And in the stage version, we've retained the title song, but we don't use the tapioca. And then there were some other new songs written for the movie. Jay Thompson contributed a song called Jimmy, which is in the stage version. And then there were old period songs. It was a lot of different sources.
So how did you address this audacious young man who was going to take his first shot at a $10 million Broadway musical?
I said no, and I hung up. No, I've written a lot of darker pieces, a lot of dramas, Violet. You know, the music for Twelfth Night was very exotic, and so Dick and I, we literally hit it off immediately. I've known Michael for a while, and I think holding a 2-hour baby, I was really, for me, it changed my point of view. I really wanted to write something that I could bring my daughter eventually to, and at that point I had not written anything that she could see, or it was really geared for anyone under 50 inches tall. And so actually when people ask me, you know, how long have you been working on Millie, I say, that long, 45 inches worth of a little girl, because she was 2 hours old when we first spoke. And so that was part of the reason, was I really, to be there night after night at this theater and hear people laugh so hard. It's the most incredible feeling I've ever had. I've never done a musical comedy before. They're the most difficult form, I think, because they're so collaborative. You know, we work completely as a team, and but it's been the absolute thrill of my, you know, dare I say, call it a career. It's been the thrill of my career to hear 1,600 people laugh that hard, listen that hard, and then jump to their feet. I've never experienced anything like it.
Spontaneously applauding and jumping to their feet.
It's bizarre.
I'm happy to see that. Well, no, it's earned. I think it's earned. No, you've earned that. So now let's see. We have the 3 of you on the team. We have Michael,
Right.
and Janine and you. And at some point, you decide it's got to get onto the stage, and you 3 of you are not going to put it on the garage somewhere, you hope. So how did you find a producer and a manager?
Well, Hal went to a very expensive tea party one day.
It was right. It was really, that's true. I was invited, I knew Michael for a while, and I was invited.
We spoke at the Tonys
Yes.
that one year.
Right.
And you came up to me and you said, what is this I hear about Thoroughly Modern Millie?
yeah.
Tell me about it. I said, it's fantastic.
Because I had a
Come
friend,
see.
my producing partners are Fox Theatricals, based in St. Louis, and I had known them for a while, and they were talking to me about this, and I knew the film. As, you know, Dick pointed out, I knew the film, and it wasn't a great film, but I had seen it. And I was talking to Michael at Tony Awards, and then I received a phone call, I guess it was 99 or...
It was 99.
99.
It was.
To come to, not exactly a backers audition, I was told. And, you know, I've been producing for about 12 years now, and I go to a lot of these things. But because Michael was, you know, asking me to go, and he was involved, I went. And it basically turned out to be, in someone's, you know, very lovely Fifth Avenue apartment, a one-person show. Dick Scanlon, with somebody on the piano, did the entire show.
Michael Rafter, our conductor.
But was Michael Rafter? I don't remember who was on the piano. Forgive me.
And Michael holding cue cards whenever I sang in Chinese.
Chinese, I would hold up.
Because it was the singularly strangest day of my life. Because it was, I had no idea where you're going. Normally, when you go to these backwards auditions, they're at, you know, the Dramatist Guild, or they're at, you know, 890, or they're at a place that you know. So I was given the address, you know, of someone's apartment. And I went in, and it was a grand old, you know, apartment with, you know, wood paneling. I was like, where am I? You know, what am I doing here? And there was nobody but just us.
There were about 18 people.
Well,
maybe.
when I walked in, there was nobody there. And there was about 18
Yeah.
people, yes, totally, sitting in this room. But it was Dick Scanlon doing the entire show, doing Millie, doing Jimmy, doing Trevor, doing Dorothy.
Singing in Chinese.
Singing in Chinese. And I was riveted. I couldn't, you know, take my eyes off not only him, but what he was doing. And I thought this was the most charming thing I had ever seen. And they actually, bless their hearts, they scheduled this reading around my schedule because I left that apartment and had to fly out to the West Coast. And the entire flight out there, I couldn't stop thinking about this, which was a signal of, wow, this is really something. Because usually these things, you know, out of sight, out of mind, this stayed with me. And that was my beginning of...
Did you respond that you wanted to do it
yes,
at that time?
I actually did. I mean, we then had a discussion about what was the next step and, you know, where they were and what we were doing. And we decided that the best thing to do would be a sort of a semi-staged reading. Is that what you would... What was that thing we did at the Lamb?
I would say it was a reading.
A
It wasn't
reading?
really
It really was.
staged. It was
Yeah.
just a really
Yeah.
good reading.
Right.
Yeah. And that, so everybody could see exactly where, you know, we were in the process.
We had more rehearsal than you usually have for a reading. It was about 3 weeks.
And we did a lot of writing.
And we
which
did
is
a
unusual.
lot of writing.
When did you do that?
Fall of
Fall of
1999.
99.
That's
That,
right.
that was the second time then you had it on its feet, as it were?
Yeah,
Not counting your, not
No.
counting your audition?
No, well, we had done readings along the way for
Right.
us. I mean, you know,
All
right,
along.
we did
probably...
little readings.
The
yeah,
first one
have.
we did was of Act 1.
Right, we
Right.
did one of Act
We
1
did
for
it
the
for 3
National
people.
I
Alliance for
remember that
Musical
one, yes.
That was
Theater.
before Janine.
Oh, right.
That's
And
right.
then
But how's that?
when you came on, when Janine came on, we did that reading of
For 4 people.
for 4 people. I think you were there.
No,
About-
Nina wasn't
no,
at
no,
that
Nina
one.
wasn't there yet.
No, that was at
Just
Manhattan
Act 1.
Theater Club.
That's right.
That's
And it
right.
was
Literally
just
for 4
Act
people.
1, and it was only very little book. It was almost all
Score.
And of course, Rob, you weren't involved because they weren't
We
with
No.
went to
you.
the Lambs.
But so then
Rob
soon,
came to the Lambs reading.
Right.
He wasn't actually.
wasn't he
No,
invited?
no
He just came, he wasn't
Right.
invited? Rob?
We
you
invited.
I don't think you smell out a good thing.
Did you invite him?
Hal Prince wrote to me
Right.
and told me about this guy Rob Ashford that I should really get to know. He says that, and he said he's the real thing, and I just have a hunch that you two would hit it off really well, and he might be just the person you're looking for Millie.
So we almost all came through you on this project.
Yeah,
in a
that's
way.
right.
You're
That's
the
right.
center of
That's right.
everything.
That's
Really, yeah? How about
As a
Nina?
good director should be.
As a
In a
writing.
sense,
How about
Nina
you?
did
Yes, because I
because
was working on
On
Charlie
Charlie
Brown
Brown.
in 1998 with Fox Theatricals and Michael, and near the end of Charlie Brown, Fox Theatricals said, we have this show, Thoroughly Modern Millie, and we're about to get ready to do a staged reading. Do you want to come on and help us manage the staged reading? This was the reading at the Lambs.
Right.
And that's all I thought it was for a moment. I had no idea what the plans for the project would be, or had no idea that I would be working on this for the next 4 years.
It's just an example of how hard it is, I think, to break into a team, because how we happened is all through talk and conversation.
Right.
And you called me, and I called you, and you came to the Lambs, and Hal Prince called you. You worked together, you knew, and suddenly you're a team. And that's,
Yeah.
you know,
That's
I
what they
wondered
call-
when I was 21 why I couldn't get in,
Right.
But
involved. in
that's the
it.
beginning of a real collaboration and how you
That's
grew.
true.
And it's, I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
what I'm amazed at is that if this was the team that started in the 90s and it's still the team that's here in 2002 past the opening, and you stayed together.
Oh, yeah.
which
and
is-
I think
And we're
that
going to do something else.
we are definitely.
starting tomorrow.
We will work together again, I think.
Do you have a 2-hour-old child?
But one of the
I
things,
hope not.
Something you haven't told me, exactly.
Roy, one of the things that's, I think, really amazing about the team is that not only are we still together, but I think that our respect and admiration and love for each other is even deeper and stronger than it was when we first started. And that's rare when you go through so much. It's so hard to do a musical. And it has, I think, bested better people than we in the past. And the fact that we have maintained our friendship and our collaboration to in such a great way is
Well, it's clear you've all grown with the experience. before going into this, you didn't have that many musicals under your belt. You had done Charlie Brown.
Charlie
Had you done-
Brown and Triumph of Love.
Triumph, right.
And they
You
were
done
both small.
Small
Triumph of
musicals,
Love had
right.
a cast of 7, and Charlie Brown had a cast of 6.
Right, and you said you didn't do any musical comedies before. I mean,
well,
you've done music. I know you've done a lot
I've
of
done
Broadway.
probably about 40 musicals since the time, because I started conducting when I was 19.
Right.
And so I music directed a lot of musical comedies. I've been part of a lot of teams. I've done about 6 or 7 Broadway shows with other directors who are really, really, as you know, like Michael Desmachinoff. I worked on Aida. I worked on just so many, watching other teams on The Secret Garden, and just how everyone kept this. You know, musicals are these huge, huge ships. They're like tankers, and you really have to be able to, I think, as the center, as Michael's really done very well, be able to steer it, and everybody else is a little bit to the side. So getting to be one of those people on the side was just extremely important for me.
Well, how do we get to a production now? You got Nina on board, and she told you couldn't afford it, probably, no doubt.
Which she does every day.
Well, but it was a very a slow and long, involved process. I mean, first, as I said, I jumped on board to help pull this reading together at the Lambs, and then it seemed like you guys needed to go back and do some writing or some working on the project for a while. I think there was a period of assessment, and you guys all went back and did some writing, and the producers went off to try to sort of figure out who all their partners would be and where the money would come from. And then over the next 2 years, we seemed to sort of go in between what would be the right steps for the show.
Well,
right?
one of the things that did happen from the Lambs, we were, you know, when we did this reading, there were several, you know, besides money people there were several regional theaters there, which, you know, you always invite just to either to see if they have any interest or if you have friends. And in this case, one of Michael's friends was taking over
Annie Hamburger.
Annie Hamburger was taking over the La Jolla Playhouse. And she saw this and said, "This would be great. I would love to have this as part of my, you know, first season at the La Jolla Playhouse. This could be our, you know, premiere musical." And, you know, God love the La Jolla Playhouse. They start a lot of shows there, obviously. You know,
Right.
Tommy started there, had a succeeded star there, and she was taking over and said, "I would love for this to be part of our season." Where their musical slot was at almost a year after we had done the reading.
That's right.
So it gave us time for these guys to go, you know, do some more writing. Gave the producers time to go find the money to do it, because these are enhanced productions, as they call them now. You know, they don't pay for everything. You have to help them.
And
it
that's
just-
when
That you
Rob
Rob
came
came
on.
and that's when Rob came on. So we were going to go to La Jolla with now a new choreographer.
Did you introduce any other creative things? Did you have designers who are with you now?
Designers
at that
were
point?
already. We already had designers attached. David Gallo, Robert Perziola, and Don Holder. I think we had already
You're-
talked to. And I don't know if we'd already talked to Otz about doing the sound for La Jolla. Otz Munderloh.
We had talked to him, yeah, absolutely.
But he hadn't necessarily signed on yet.
No, Otz waits till the last minute.
But one of the things that we didn't
Right.
talk about was in terms of, I'm sorry.
Go on. I'm listening to you.
Because there are not a lot of new musicals, and we are so lucky to have one, a new phenomenon has started where choreographers literally audition, take some relevant, so I don't know if you wanted to,
Yeah,
because
well-
that was the part where you did that.
Right. At the time when I came to this reading at the Lambs, I was assisting Kathleen Marshall on Kiss Me Kate, I think, at the time. And I got the invitation, I knew through Michael, to come to this reading, and I sat there salivating, thinking, oh my gosh, this is so fun. How great it would be to get to choreograph a show like this, a show that naturally dances. The show just has so much dance in it. But because I was an assistant and not a choreographer, a tried and true choreographer on my own, I didn't think I had very much of a chance. But they did hold some auditions. They were looking for a choreographer, and so because of Michael and the Hal Prince recommendation, I did get a chance to audition for Millie.
How does a choreographer audition?
Well, it's not easy. I have to tell you, it's not easy. The assignment was 2 numbers that you did for the show. One was a number from the show, which was the elevator number, which at that time was Stumbling, when Miss Dorothy and Millie meet each other. That was the first assignment. And the second was totally up to you, not necessarily from the show, but hopefully using a large number of people so that they could see that you could move a group around the stage. And at the time when we actually were doing, when they were actually seeing the choreography, the auditions, I was working with Michael on a play that had a little bit of dance to it down at the Vineyard. And Michael said, I'd really love for you to do this. Well, at that time, I was assisting Kathleen on Saturday night at Second Stage. And we were in the middle of tech. And Michael was like, well, this is the time. I mean, you've got to do it this week. And so trying to, the people at Second Stage were so nice. They allowed me to use their rehearsal room. I called dancers that I'd worked with because I was just in Victoria 2 years before. I called dancers that I knew, please come help me. And we put together, and David Chase, who was a friend and a great dance arranger, who ended up being the dance arranger on the show, to help me put together these auditions. Well, I got together the elevator number, but that's all I had time for. So I just did the one number with 3 girls, and just hoped and prayed that that would be enough.
It was great.
It was inspiring.
It was great. It told a story.
That's right.
Well, who was paying for all of this at the time? And this was blind. You were just doing this on spec?
Well, yeah, but with very assured spec, if there's such a thing. Because I just knew, my gut just told me that these guys were the real thing. The team was the real deal. They all just worked well together, and the show was, coming together, and everyone sort of had the same vision. And there are times that, as a producer, you just sort of, I feel like you just push you just push everybody in, or you're just there to support everybody or create an environment to let the team work. And this team just functioned as one of the best well-oiled machines that I had ever seen.
Well, let's see if we get in perspective. Prior to going to La Jolla, how much money had been invested in getting it that far?
Well, but I think if just to put it in outside of the La Jolla enhancement, there was about $400,000 spent in the development of the show over a period of 5 years.
Yeah.
4 or 5 years. $400,000, which includes the little readings, includes the little rehearsal times, the little
lunch.
workshop. Okay, lunch here and there.
Legal fees.
Was all that recoverable out of the production costs when you
Yes.
moved it?
Yes.
Right.
That all became part of the capitalization.
Right.
And had the show ended before La Jolla, you would have invested $400,000.
For not, yes.
And after plus then you added the La Jolla enhancement
Yes.
money to that.
And that's true. And if the show didn't go anywhere after La Jolla, yes, that would have been.
That's a pretty bold.
though.
Yeah.
That's a pretty bold confidence, isn't it? In this, that you
Well-
coming $500,000 on
That's what I want to get
unknown.
to, about the money part. Where did the money come from? And this is such a big undertaking. You're also very young. How did you go about getting money? And what about, were there royalties to be
Isabel,
paid?
the same way that anyone really gets money. The La Jolla production, even though it was a financial undertaking, from a producerial point of view, it was a great showcase. We were able to bring money people out to La Jolla and say, look at this. I mean, the show is so great that, in a way, it was sort of the easiest sell I've ever had to do, because all I had to do was march somebody down to their seat and stand back and let the show just wash over them. And then, they came back to me and said, this is wonderful. What's the plan? What are you going to do? So, La Jolla served, from the producing point, I'm sure.
And these people, how are they all theater investors? Is that how you know them, or are they from different walks of life?
You know what? They're from different walks of life. Personally, I found it easier dealing with people who had invested in theater before, because then they understand the mechanics, how it works, how you make your money back.
How does it work?
The recruitment.
How do you make your money back?
By a good general manager.
A good general manager.
We should talk about the IPN also.
Yeah. Well, they came on board, after La Jolla. But that's a great case. I mean, we have a big piece of investment from this new group out on the road called the Independent Producers Network, or IPN. And what that is just recently, with the road sort of changing its face as it has, A lot of markets are, now owned by Clear Channel. And there are, however, about 40 independent presenters.
I think
out
we
on
should
the-
explain that Clear Channel Entertainment.
Clear
is
Channel
who they
Entertainment,
are.
yes,
But
yeah.
they have some 150, almost 100 venues.
Venues,
which,
right,
throughout
right.
the United States
And all the
Europe.
radio, almost
Right.
all the radio.
They're,
Channel
they're a
now-
huge entertainment
And they're now
conglomerate.
producers on the show as well.
Well, yes, they came on as associate because, well, this was a sign of how much they loved the show. But at the time of La Jolla, when we were just sort of at the ground level of, seeing where this money would come from, these independent presenters came out to La Jolla and said, this show would be great on the road. Our audiences, our subscription audiences, would love this. It has everything they're looking for: singing, dancing, great story, whatever they went down their checklist. And so they came on board as one of our producing partners, an investment really only, to make sure that when Millie goes out on the road, it goes to their cities first. So that was a unique form of
I think
cataloging
this is the
show.
first time
Yeah, oh, it's
that
so-
they've invested at this level.
Yes,
And you're talking
totally.
about 40 theaters across the country, each putting in about $25,000, $50,000, small amounts, and they for the chance to be a part of the show and for the chance to get it first on their
Right.
season. And they realize that they can't just sit out there and expect product to come to them. They want to jump in and support a show and try to get that show out to their cities.
But Nina, that's serves you secondary as well, because once you're ready to put a touring show out, now that we've lost our sequence, let's jump ahead for a minute. You've got bookings there. When you've
Yeah.
got bookings in those theaters, you've got a successful tour.
There's already
So
40 weeks booked
Well,
for
more
for
than that, a
this-
few weeks
right.
ago, Clear
Right.
Channel came to one of our previews and said, wow, this is fabulous. We want in on this too. And they came on as an associate producer for a smaller amount of money, and with the caveat that they now, we've worked out, a deal where some of the 40 get it first and some of the Clear Channel, then get it tour. So we basically have now a 2-year tour.
One
just
company.
from
One
partners.
company. You didn't, I wondered if you had to go into a second company right away in order to accommodate both those large venue groups.
You mean IPN and...
Yeah, and
No,
Clear
well, we're talking about one tour at the moment.
Nina's turning white.
One tour at the moment.
One tour.
Well, how many? At this moment, how many producers do you have on the show? When it came into New York, how many producers are there?
Well, there are 2 general partners, which you understand that there are 2 general partners, and there's an IPN is 4.
Can't count
Mary
on
Stewart.
Stewart.
Libby.
Right, I thought there was 5.
Jimmy Niederlander.
I have them. So
Right.
that's 5. There's really 6 major producers, and of those 6 major producers, you always see more than that above the title, because rights and people. Whatever they
I think we should explain that. No, I think we should explain that.
Well,
Why you have a dozen names
when a
or
person
more.
puts in a substantial amount of money, they want to know, they want to have their name above title as a presenter, which they're certainly, entitled to
Do they contribute anything other than money?
in terms of like artistic or producerial
Or name, like,
like
Whoopi
like
Goldberg.
Whoopi. Well, Whoopi brought in more than name.
right,
she
but
was,
I'm just saying that's,
But
Yeah.
the name of Niederlander is a
Yeah.
value, just as
Right.
as Whoopi is in terms of.
But I think the
Prestige.
producers have been very careful in funneling comments from those, all those producers through Hal or Fox Theatricals or other general partner,
Yeah.
because you really can't have
No.
9 or
How many
people.
bosses do you have? In other words, right
Well,
now, what you
basically,
say you have one.
Hal and Fox Theatricals
Right.
too.
Yeah, we're the
Are
general
responsible.
partners of the show. And then everyone else, the Niederlanders, have, they're involved, and there's Stuart Lane and the Independent Producers Network. Some people are more involved, Isabel, as they come to more meetings. Stuart Lane is very involved. He's here in New York. He's at the theater quite a bit. He comes to meetings, ad meetings, marketing meetings, things like that. So, it varies from person to person. But the reason, most of the time, the reason that you see so many names above the title, it's a financial consideration. When a person
And the opening night party.
and the opening night, right. Oh,
Which was fabulous.
Can I tell you something? If producing this show was difficult, that party, arranging that party, and Nina is my witness, was like, I'll produce a show anytime. Who can't sit by who, and who has to sit next to who?
It's almost we'd rather give everyone the money and just say, go have
Just go
fun.
have fun. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe, the politicking of, getting those seats in that theater.
But it worked. The bouncers had to throw us out. And the party was so fun.
Yeah,
At the
the
end of
party
the
was
evening,
great.
they had to call security from the hotel.
kick us
I
out.
literally formed like a chain and pushed the revelers out because no one wanted to leave.
It really was a great party. I have
I
to
can
say.
remember when you used to tell people you're going to produce a show, and they wouldn't say, what's the name of the show, what kind of a show it is. They'd always say, where's the party?
Right.
And then talk about the show.
Truly unbelievable.
I want to go back. I might have missed something on the rights, the movie rights. How did you get that?
Well, do you mean the rights
The
to do
universe.
this?
To do the show.
Richard Morris had retained what is called the dramatic stage rights when he wrote the film, which is not the whole story. That gave him the right to tell the story on stage, to use the dialogue, the characters, the plot. What Universal still retained was the use of the title, the use to advertise anything called Thoroughly Modern Millie, and the use to
The song, well, that one became
songs,
a
and the
sticky
right to
wicket.
merchandise anything called Thoroughly Modern Millie. So clearly, you can't produce a show if you can't use the title, you can't advertise it, you can't merchandise it, you can't use the songs. So Universal entered into a deal with the producers.
And as Dick had said earlier, it's much easier to get anything from an individual as it is from a corporation. We went through several months of either not getting phone calls returned, oh, I'm sorry, that's not my department, I'll have to transfer you. Well, why did they send you to me? That's not my department. You need to go talk to so. Oh, I don't know.
Well, that's what's
we
really
went through.
tricky about movie rights, because having tried to get some before, they're so collaborative that they themselves don't even know who has the rights.
Right.
So you talk to someone and they say, oh, we do, and then you talk to someone else, we don't. And so part of it's just so athletic, just finding out the information.
I have a little history of this with Dick, because at one point, 8, 9 years ago, whenever
You
it
were
was,
one of the people whose door I
Right.
tried to knock down.
And I remember saying, Dick, don't do this, don't go any further with this until you get the rights from Universal.
Right.
Right.
And
Right.
when we went to Universal at the time, they said, who's Dick Scanlon? And he said, he's approved by Richard Morris. And they said, we don't care, Dick Scanlon. And suddenly, that property, which was collecting dust on the shelves, nobody cared about, suddenly, there was great interest in preserving Thoroughly Modern Millie. And
Right.
I know how I know what you must have
Do
gone
you know,
through.
I
because-
just, this is aside from Thoroughly Modern Millie, but, just a lesson learned from all of that. I'm in the process now of trying to obtain a right of a film. And it's now how, think people just kind of come out of the woodwork. What even the studio said, oh, we have the rights to everything. You just deal with us. Now, not only the woman who wrote the screenplay has surfaced, the person who now claims wrote the article of which the
Screenplay was based.
the screenplay
Right.
was, and this woman, another woman who has said her book was based on the story from the article. I finally said just the other day, you know what? You guys work it out. Here's my number. When you do, because I'm not. You can't. You can spend years chasing this stuff.
Actually, I remember they told us at the time, the person who was in charge of it said, yes, you may do it, but. And he had to clear it with a few other people, and we never got any further.
Right, that's
Yeah.
right.
Well, could we go back? Could we go back to La Jolla? No.
No.
And
I actually would.
tell us about the travails,
Literally?
because there's something I sense you had. You said there was adversity there.
La
What
Jolla-
happened in La Jolla?
What Hal said when he talked about what our slot was in the season at La Jolla, we were the last show of Annie Hamburger's first and last season as artistic director at La Jolla
It was a
Playhouse.
strange choice of Thoroughly
Right.
Modern Millie is a strange choice for her.
It was a
She's built
strange choice for
reputation
her,
She was a
but she was a
strange
strange
choice
choice
for
for
them,
for
and
that,
so,
that
you
theater.
know.
We were actually a good choice for the theater.
Yes,
and
we
it
were a
was-
great choice for the
I mean,
theater.
this is not to denigrate her.
She's
We all
a
know that-
wonderful person,
She's a wonderful
and,
person.
And her talent.
and we all plan. I think we're all going to work with her at Disney at some point. But the thing is, by the time our show came around to their season, they'd wrapped up, I think, 4 very ambitious, complicated productions. Annie had resigned. The production manager was on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
And Des McAnuff was asked to come back.
But this is before Des came back. No one was running the ship there.
This is a typical theater.
And they had basically, they had no money and no support at all. So by the time we got there, the set had not started yet.
And they didn't want to tell us, so Michael and I would go into the shop, and Millie has an enormous set, and we'd say, well, we're working. And we'd be in the shop, and there was nothing. There was a hotel desk for the persona. Where are the big panels? They're in another part of the shop. It's like, but this is the whole shop. Where are you? Oh, no, we're working. And finally, they sort of sheepishly said, we're a little behind. Oh my God.
Then we were doing our thing and getting quite a lot done, actually, in the room with the actors and with the dancers and everything. We were working really hard, plugging away, rewriting constantly, as we are wont to do. And then we would have these horribly depressing production meetings once a week, where it was just one bit of grim news after
reliving
another.
this is making my stomach. I had forgotten.
They had hired some woman to create a computer program that would operate all of the automation for the show, which included a turntable and a series of sliding panels. That was basically how the show moved. You couldn't get from one scene to another without the panels and or the turntable working. Well, I think her experience to that point had been, I don't know, some sort of .com stuff, She
had never worked in the
computer
theater.
graphics or something, I don't know what. So she'd created this program that didn't work. It simply didn't work. So by the time we were supposed to start dry teching the show, the turntable wouldn't move.
It was more dry than tech.
Yes.
It was more dry.
So that truly we had to keep postponing the tech. Finally, by the time we were actually supposed to be on stage, we would get this sort of demoralizing report from the very depressed production manager, and she would basically say, okay guys, here's the story. In 2 hours, we're going to know whether or not we're going to be able to start work on the turntable before dinner or first thing tomorrow morning. So we would show up 2 hours later and go, okay, what's the story? Well, if you come back in an hour, we're going to know whether the turntable's going to be moving before dinner or not. And it went on like day after day.
Sort of the Sartre question: if a musical is produced in the forest and no one sees it, was it ever produced?
Was the producer sitting through this?
Actually, and I took sort of like this very cavalier attitude because I had, all the faith in the world that they would do this. So these guys would, they were, the producers went out the beginning of the rehearsal process, and, La Jolla is a very lovely place. I mean, La Jolla, California. So, I would go out there. They would be, ensconced in the rehearsal, room, and, we would go and have a lovely lunch on the beach, and, look how sweet this is. And I had total faith that when they said they would build the set, and these guys would come to me, and Michael would tell me this, and I would say, Michael, calm down. If they said they're going to do it, they're going to do it. We have total faith in this. And it wasn't until really we got on the stage and we saw that nothing worked. And even then, I sort of said, you know what? It's their subscription audience. It's their problem, guys. They have to have the performance. You'll be amazed. This is regional theater. They will make this work. Just, it may not be perfect, but they will make it work. And it became clear, I don't know, a couple of days, literally a couple of days before we were supposed to have the first preview, that
They weren't going to make it work.
Is
It,
this a
was, it
union?
just wasn't going to happen, and that's when we kicked it.
They weren't going to come close.
No.
Were you running up a huge building? Is this a union operation?
No,
backstage?
it's not really a union operation. And the difficulty, because I was back in New York and I get these calls like, oh, it's really a problem out here, or they don't seem to know what they're doing sort of technically. But the problem is when you're in that environment, that regional theater environment, you have to let them sort out their own problems to a certain extent. We ended up sending people out to try and help them and to try to get them back on track, but they obviously undertook a set that they didn't have the resources to build.
But they were your designers.
I
They were
think
your-
it's very,
That's right.
But
it's
we
very
should
important
say-
to say that they had all the best intentions.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And those
Yeah.
people.
But not only that, I mean, we did Tommy out there, and Tommy was just this incredibly technically difficult. So I want
It
to be
was the end
careful
of
that
a grueling
Right.
season
it was
for
a
them.
happenstance at this theater. I mean,
You know,
Tommy
the
had
Annie
this
left,
and that.
and
It was,
Right.
it, we,
Yeah.
it was, there was a
However.
whole series of problems. It was a parade of horribles.
Right, and we realized at some point, the producers, you know, how this works, Roy, is, you know, as a producer, you make a deal with the theater. They say, okay, this show, let's just make numbers up because I don't even remember at this point. Let's say the show, you know, costs $3 million to do at La Jolla Playhouse. The theater says, okay, here's what we have budgeted. We have $1.5 million. If you want to have a, you know, a production of Thoroughly Modern Millie, you come up with $1.5 million, and here's what you will get, you know, for it. You'll get to see the show on its feet. You'll get to use it as a sort of tryout, if you will, although things will change. You can use it to bring backers to see it, to possibly raise money, and there are certain physical elements of the show that you may be able to keep if you choose to, such as some costumes, some set pieces. You know, lights are usually rented, so you're not going to have that. Props, things, yeah, things like that. So for a producer, it's
How about orchestrations, though?
perhaps the
Were you
orchestrations,
using-
although
have
your
the same
orchestra's
size orchestra?
probably going to...
No, we didn't. So we didn't have the same size orchestra.
No,
we
no, no.
had.
Well, that's what I was going to
But
say.
often what happens, we had 12 pieces, and Ralph Burns, who unfortunately is not here, he did those orchestrations, and we used them truly as the core and expanded. So it was a very useful
Yes,
thing.
yeah.
It wasn't like going from zero to, you know.
So you do get things, you know, for
Well,
it.
does the
It-
general manager come in at that point? Can the general manager say, look, this is not working, let's do something else? What is the role of the general manager?
Well, that's when
Let's
you sent people
Right,
out
but
to...
essentially, if the decision is made for a regional theater to do the production, it is their production. I can't get
Right.
involved in general managing it. I don't know how to hire
They have their own
non-union
general
crew.
manager,
They have their
basically.
own manager. They have their own crew, their own staff, their own way of doing things. What happened for my office at that point was, for everybody to go out and work on the La Jolla production, everyone wanted their first-class contracts done at that sort of simultaneously with the La Jolla deal. Because people said, I'm not going to go and work out in La Jolla for 2 cents unless I know I have my contract done and we're going to go to Broadway. So in a way, it was good for us because we got a jump on doing everyone's contract. We got really a head start on getting all the designers lined up, all the creative team, all of that sort of squared away, the orchestrators contract, everything, so that when the time came to come to Broadway, we actually were in really good shape. Everybody's contract was done. There was no rush for that. And so we prepared and sort of set up the structure and got everyone's deals squared away. But the actual workings of the production in La Jolla, I can't contribute to because they have their own way of working. When it became difficult for them, we did make some calls. We tried to get some people out and some technical people to help. And
And that turned us around.
but it
that's
was
why-
still
that's
very
why-
difficult,
See, you're-
though, because they had their own programs and own way of working. It wasn't like, you know, if I had a problem in New York, I could call any shop in New York and they could come and help me, and they would understand the language that was being used to sort of sort out technical problems or to deal with scenery.
Well,
This was slightly
you know,
different.
we were hearing a lot about the show while it was in La Jolla, in New York, as people do. The vultures were hovering, as you know. But did you had you hired your press people at that point?
They have their own press.
Yes.
La Jolla has their own press. We
Great
did have a
press
press
agent.
we did have a press agent.
But you didn't know you had La Jolla's, but you
Yeah,
didn't.
Josh
didn't-
Ellis.
Right.
Is
Yeah, but
fantastic.
the former Broadway,
Right,
very
exactly.
outstanding Broadway
Wonderful.
press. But you didn't hire anybody then to
Yes.
talk about New York at that point.
We had engaged we hadn't engaged them officially yet, but we did have a press person that we were going to use. We have since changed, but at the time, yes, we did.
Well, I think that time some of the job of your press person was to keep information out of the press in New York, I think, and probably did a fairly decent job because
Yeah, I guess so. But the thing that was interesting was there was the show was terrifically well received.
It was
from the very beginning. So any press that was coming out of La Jolla, aside from just technical glitches, was all extremely positive. So there
But
wasn't.
I think with the advent of the net, and we all know what's happening, you know, with chat rooms, and I think there's a confusion, it seems to be, like what has been published and typed gossip becomes believed.
As
It's
news,
my
right.
greatest pain of being a writer in this business is that there's something that happens with computers, that when people's dialogue gets typed out, people believe it to be true.
Well, it's written down.
So it's almost like people have become individual press people, and it's geometric, so that comes out, and I think that is a very difficult thing to rein in as a press person. That started happening much to our favor, but any mishaps that were going on or delays became expanded, and they would come back to us and from people from New York saying, "Oh, I hear that you're delayed for 3 months." It's like, what are you talking about? You know?
But tell about the company itself at that time. You had a cast.
Yes. Yeah, they were great. It was so sad to see them all in makeup and costume and wigs and sitting there, and we would call them
All
together
dressed
and
up
say,
with no
go to
faces.
dinner,
Right.
go to the
Right.
beach,
Go to the
come
beach.
back
That's
at
right.
6, and they'd come back and they'd all get ready, and we'd say,
Take off your
go
makeup.
home, see you tomorrow, and
We had one performance where we did it in chairs.
Yeah.
You know,
First
we
preview
did the
that we had.
opening
No,
number,
but it was supposed to be
and then we
right,
brought
but it
up
was
chairs.
actually
We
like
danced,
And
we danced the
stands.
opening
Right.
number, and then we brought
what
up chairs.
became our first preview
It
Right.
was,
was
yeah.
partially staged reading.
And the thing was, as we've all said, La Jolla had the best intentions, so it wasn't about that. They were more, and we were very, sort of freaked out by it, but they were much more freaked out by it because they're a subscription house, and they rely on their donors and their subscribers and their community, and when these people would show up, 600, I think it was like a 600-seat theater. They would show up and they would,
to be
with their
turned
tickets
away.
in hand, and
Yes.
I'm ready to see
have to turn
Millie.
them away.
They would have to go home. And
How long was the engagement? How long was this engagement?
the initial engagement was
We
like
extended several
time.
times.
Yeah.
So it was supposed to be like 8 weeks, and then we kept
It
extending.
was 10 weeks, and
10
we
weeks?
extended.
And we were supposed to extend it. But some of these people, Roy, would have tickets for Monday night, and we didn't have a show, so they would somehow pick the next Wednesday. And some of these people came back 2 or 3 times, never to see, Thoroughly Modern Millie. So La Jolla was really, really upset by this, and they were trying every which way to get it done. But as Nina said, we finally stepped up and said, you know what? We have a vested interest in making this thing happen, like now. And when you do a regional production, for the most part, you're a guest in someone's home. And you can't walk in there and say, okay, this is how we're going to, arrange the china. You have to sort of let them do it.
It was an extreme situation there. It's not
but
the
you
way
extended.
it usually
I mean,
works.
Oh, once we started
Great
to go,
response.
great response.
All right from the
And
beginning.
in fact, I think that their subscription drive that happened during the run of Millie increased their following year's subscription hugely. I think it was
It's a huge
very
success.
Well, how long did you finally play?
We played from early October and we closed on December 10th. And they wanted to extend further, but the actors just wanted to go home. It was just getting close to Christmas, and people
Right.
had lives.
At that time, did you know you were coming to New York?
Yes. At one point during the La Jolla run, the producers had, we all made a decision that this was worthy of doing, and we knew we were going to come from
funny how that works, because I always knew. I never doubted we would. I never doubted
Personally,
that we
I
would.
didn't either. I didn't either. But there comes a moment, Roy, when you have to say, okay, it's official. Let's say it officially. We're coming to Broadway. Where just because, as Janine said, it stops being gossip, or it stops being rumor, or it stops being they possibly are. When you say we are coming, and you speak to a theater owner, and the theater owner commits a theater, and you then enter the highway.
There is a story about the cast then, and the cast did not stay exactly as you had it in New York.
We did make a change. The actress who was originally playing Millie in La Jolla, at a certain point, late into rehearsals, very near the time we were starting tech, I had a conversation with her, and it was decided that she was not able to fulfill the demands of the role at that time. And we were very fortunate in that her understudy, Sutton Foster, stepped up to the plate in a completely miraculous way and immediately defined the role of Millie as it had never been defined in any previous incarnation, and was completely illuminating to us.
And is that is that the company that came into New York subsequently?
Well, some are. There were a lot of, again, going to La Jolla, there were a lot of considerations that we had to do. They wanted us to hire as many local people as possible, which we tried to accommodate.
Students.
Students were in the
At
show. There were
UCSD.
seniors there, had to be in the show. There was...
And they were good.
They were good.
There was some non-union dancers that they insisted upon just to keep costs low. We expanded the cast here. So there were a lot of conditions in La Jolla. And we defined the show, what the show really needed and didn't need. So there were some changes as far as the ensemble goes, according to those.
And the principals too. I mean,
yeah.
the roles were substantially rewritten and rethought. I think that once we knew Sutton was our Millie, I think she really determined a lot in terms of just who she is as an actress and as a character. We needed to build a cast around her, so some changes needed to be made in that regard also.
Okay, so we now have we're about at Christmas time, and you know you're coming to New York.
Well, I'd
supposed to
also
come
like
this
to say
spring.
the producers were terrific because they kept us, the creative team, in La Jolla throughout the entire run to continue working on the show. So we were able to stay there and continue the work.
Which is not how it's usually
Which is
done.
not at all how, and we did a lot of good work. We were able to go there and see it in the evening. We were able to brainstorm in the day, and then go and then try to imagine the thoughts of that day fitting into that production we saw at night. It was very advantageous to the process.
It's been produced so well, this piece, and part of it is that there's the new phenomenon also of using regional theaters as a means to an end, and how you are. I mean, Hal said it so well, you're a guest in their house, but you are a guest with great demands of being a guest. You're not a guest that's just going to sit by the fireplace. You're going to, look out the window and rearrange the furniture, and that's why you're there. And so there's this constant balance. That Nina said, like, they have their own government, they have their own press, they have their own manager going on, but you are looking to be able to work and change, and regional theaters are not always built that way. They often, they'll produce something that stays the same from opening night. And we kept working.
Right.
And they kept us out there so we could keep looking at it and, because the piece is fluid, and it was fluid all through previews
Right.
here.
But that's very consistent with the way that the show's been produced since the very first reading that
Right.
we did. Was this producing team has been, I think, unique in that they understood from the beginning what the developmental process for a show like this needed to be.
Because the
and every
changes-
step of the way, we
Right.
had some very strange readings that were just, like we said before, just singing the songs.
For 4 people.
For 4 people.
Or
but we had
just the
to hire
producers
actors
with
and
Nina in a
rehearse.
room. We did a lot of that.
And
Right.
that kind of work really paid off. And to
We're
have that
going
kind
to
of
want to move the
support.
show to New York and hear all about that. But before we do, why don't we pause now and have a word about the American Theater Wing, given to us by Isabel Stevenson. Can we please?
Before we get back to the American Theater Wing seminar on working in the theater, this is on Production, the wonderful show of Thoroughly Modern Millie. I want to remind you that these seminars are only one of many programs that the Wing undertakes. You are probably familiar with the American Theater Wing's Tony Awards given for excellence in the craft of theater, but we also have a very substantial grants and scholarship program, providing aid to off-off and off-off Broadway theaters, as well as to promising students to pursue studies in the theater arts. As a long-established charity, the Wing has other meaningful and thriving programs, all designed to promote excellence in the theater and to introduce young people and their families to theater and the magic it unfolds. Our hospital programs, dating back to World War II, when we also created the legendary Stage Door canteens to entertain patients in hospitals, nursing homes, aid centers, and child care facilities, continue. We take pride in the work we do. Our work is very important to the theater and the community, and we're proud to be a part of this exciting industry. Now, let's return to our panel on production and our moderator, Roy Somlyo, President of the American Theater Wing. Roy?
Thank you, Isabel. You know, it occurs to me we've been talking about Thoroughly Modern Millie, and I wonder if it wouldn't be a good idea if we took a look at what it sounds like and what it probably sounded like in La Jolla when you left it. So why don't we take a look at Sutton Foster and the company with a little clip. Can we look at the tape now?
But the fact is, everything today is the modern. Bands are getting jazzier. Everything today is starting to go. Cars are getting snazzier. Men say it's criminal what women will do. What they're forgetting is this is 1922.
Now that was terrific. Now we begin to understand why so much hard work took place, because that's the result. I think we paused when you were just about moving out of La Jolla, having had this lovely time down there. And so what happened? How'd you get to, then we're going to go right to New York, right? So there's a story there too about your theater, et cetera. You want to tell us about that?
No, there is. We made the commitment to come to New York, and we were scheduled to open at the. First, we had to find the theater owner and the theater, and Jimmy Niederlander had come out to La Jolla and loved it. So the Niederlanders became our producing partner. And then we, went through the process of what theater we could do.
Well, I have to say, at that point, I was doing, it seemed like hundreds of budgets of variations on a theme, because there was also a discussion about going out of town before we came to New York. So the producers asked me to look at scenarios where perhaps we would do an out-of-town in New Haven and then come into New York, and where we would also, and there was a scenario about going to the Ordway in St. Paul, and then come into New York. But, as we discussed earlier, the cost of the initial development and the cost of the La Jolla enhancement had to be included in the overall capitalization for the show.
To about $2 million at that point, I would think.
And actually, it ended up to about 1.4, 1.5. So adding an out-of-town to the budget would have added another $1 million to like 1.2. So when we looked at I actually did all of those budgets, and we looked at every which way we could reduce that cost and make it as inexpensive as possible. But we still couldn't get the overall budget down to a number that would enable us to go comfortably into a New York theater and recoup. So the producers then got together with the creative team and had this discussion with all of you, right? And said, even though you guys really want an out-of-town, we just can't afford an out-of-town financially.
Well, the one that was on the table, and we said, we all agreed that it wouldn't be purposeful for us, was there was the Ordway on the table. And again, the Ordway is a great theater, and it operates under a very, sort of strange situation. Half of it's a half LORT, half out-of-town regional. So, and we could have gone there and perhaps even made it financially, workable, but we wouldn't have had the full complement of the orchestra. Our set wouldn't have been the total full set. And we all talked about that. We said, well, what's the point? That's not going to work.
We've already done that.
Right, we've already done that.
The
So
LORT being the League of Regional Theaters. The LORT.
LORT is
Yes.
actually a cost contract. It's something. It's, as Hal said, it's this hybrid. It's this in-between situation between an out-of-town Broadway, a real out-of-town Broadway tryout.
yeah, and it's very strange about what you can do and what they can give you and what
the number of rehearsal hours you get once you're up and running
Right.
is somewhat
Well, Nina,
limited. and-
right.
Want to explain though? You said that you came up with several budgets, and if you added an additional city out of town, it would make it impractical because you couldn't recoup your costs. How do you come to that conclusion?
Well, I think you need to look at we knew this was going to be a large musical. We knew we were going to be with the Nederlanders. Everyone knew very early on that they wanted to go into the Marquee Theater. And so, it's got 1,600 seats. You multiply 1,600 seats by the top price that a musical can command these days. And you can figure out very quickly on a piece of paper how much you're going to make each week. We know the numbers of people that are going to be in the show. We know roughly the size of we know the cast. We know roughly the size of the crew and wardrobe department. So once you subtract all of that, you come very quickly. You can see we only can make this much each week. These are our expenses. This is what we're going to be left with each week to pay back our startup costs. I mean, most people look at a budget the wrong way. They get carried away by a $10 million show or a $9.5 million show. The more important figure to look at is how much money can you make every week? Because you're going to have to pay back that initial.
And what's the period of time you think is reasonable to pay it back?
I always tell my investors that you really need to to look at a number, a budget. You really have to be looking at anywhere between 36 and 45 weeks, almost sometimes a
Within a
year.
year.
Sometimes a year.
And that be at what % capacity, would you say?
When I do these and I raise money, I always look at between 75 and 80. Because you can also get very fooled when you look at these numbers. If you take the Marquee Theater and you multiply every seat times the full dollar amount at 100% capacity, I think we can pay back, it was like in 22 weeks or something. But nobody does 100% of capacity. I mean, if you really take it, literally, yes, maybe, the Lion King and maybe the producers, but, you always have either press or you have a couple of dead seats or you have obstructed view seats that you can't really sell at full price, and so nobody really does that. And if you buy into that notion that you're going to do 100%, then you get disgruntled investors because they look at that and say, wait a minute, how come we've been running for 30 weeks and I haven't gotten my money back?
So what did you decide that, for the budget? How much did you what was your final figure for the budget?
The final capitalization is 9.5.
9.5. And you'd spent $1.4 million already.
Right. So let's say
Yeah.
$1.5 million.
$1.5 million
Yeah.
was part of that. So you now had $8 million
Yes.
to spend
To
bring that in. And did that frighten you?
Why? They didn't raise it. Why would it frighten them? What frightened them? If somebody came to me and said, knock yourself out, I'd be, you're asking the wrong party.
I knew you could get the money. It's a question of, was that enough to reach your ideals?
I wasn't. I thought that the show was appropriately capitalized. I think the director, who's so much more involved with the design, there's always sort of.
And the choreographer.
That's right. There's always,
And the
you could always keep
designers,
going one level up.
Right.
But as
The music. I was thinking of the music. as a
But
matter
I
of
have
fact.
to say, I have not. The greatest thing about opening is I sleep again, because not only because I have a 4-year-old, but also it's a huge pressure. I feel a lot of pressure to the orchestra, the cast, the crew, the people in the audience, the investors, because basically it starts with a blank page, and that would be us.
Right.
And I think to not acknowledge that this is a business is really foolish. I mean, we are in as artists, but I've done 75-seat black box. That's where I really do pure art. This is something very different. We're here to entertain, to get people into the theater, to get the investors back their money, to put New York theater back and bustling. I feel And it's, I have to say, we slept maybe well, you sleep anywhere. But really, he'll have like a Coke and a Milky Way and he's out, you know. But it's a lot. It's a lot to really take on. I feel that responsibility, you know, in my conscience, that people get what they paid for, that I fulfill what we committed to each other.
Well,
So
it's always a balance, because you want the thing to look like a $10 million musical, right? And you don't want to have to pay $10 million for it.
Right.
So it's a constant juggling. And when Rob and I were going through the whole show with the designers, we had to make a series of compromises at certain points. And some of those hurt while you're doing it. And other times what happens is, and I love this about the theater, I think it's unique, is that when you're faced with a particular challenge, often the solution that you come up with is better than the solution you would have had if you had all the money in the world thrown at you.
Well, how much of the salvage was there in terms of scenery and costumes? We already talked about some orchestrations, but what was salvaged from La Jolla?
We salvaged the poof that Millie sits on in her 11 o'clock number.
A couple of props.
Some desks, some of the desks,
So none of the
hand
sets.
props.
So the sets that were having trouble working at the beginning.
They're in Southern
They're-
California.
They're in set heaven.
Yeah.
Right.
And none of the clothes.
None of the
None of
clothes.
the clothes. None of the clothes.
So that's why that $8 million was like doing a $10 million musical for $8 million.
That's what we did.
Oh, yes, we basically started from scratch. I mean, I figured if we could use some La Jolla pieces, that would be great, but that was like a bonus.
Now, talk about recasting and regrouping. That's when
Well, the size of the cast was the next question. How much larger of a cast did we need? I do know that the producers felt that we did need to enhance the cast a bit, size-wise, the ensemble especially. But we also didn't want to get into the thing of having, 60 dancers and singers on stage, because we didn't need them, and our story didn't need them.
Right.
Well, we just saw the clip that we saw filled the stage and it told your story.
Right.
So you made obviously you made the right decision.
Right, we added 4 more on stage, 5 more on stage ensemble members, and all of our understudies and swings than we had in La Jolla. That's the difference in size.
But the principles were the same. The principles were
Same
the
number of
same
principals.
number.
One of them.
Basically,
How
one
about
of our
recasting?
principals was from the ensemble, and Equity determined that her role was a principal contract. So now we instead of 8 principals and an ensemble, we have now 9 principals and an ensemble.
Of
One of the
20.
other things
Of
that
20.
that
What's
we
the size of
did,
the ensemble?
20.
20.
9 principals.
4
20, so-
offstage swings, 1 standby.
And 1 standby. One of the other things that changed from La Jolla, we made substantial changes in the play, and one of the things that we did was we decided wisely, very wisely, to populate the scenes more with characters, other characters that we would pull from the ensemble. So in addition to just expanding the ensemble, we also cast the new members of the ensemble with an eye toward the character parts that they would be playing throughout. Girls that stay in the Hotel Priscilla, people at the Speakeasy, that sort of thing.
And because everyone in the show dances, everyone. So it was the difficult task was incredible singers who danced really well. Because that's not always the case. I mean, it's tougher, but
It's a New York specialty, I think. That I mean, they don't have to be too New York, but I think everyone trains, and a lot of people come here. Some of them stay in regional theaters because there's a lot of talent out there. But it's awesome when you really. I found out in previews really what this cast can do. We threw so much stuff. They never played the same show, not once, all through until we froze the show that Friday before we opened.
Right.
And I mean, substantial changes, not just this or that, but this and that and this, and so it's not just their ability to populate, but they had to shift gears and perform it every night as opposed to get through it. It was astonishing.
Talk more about the music too. I don't know how much that changed from originally, but right now you have a combination of various styles, everything, and it's so beautifully woven into it. I think maybe could you talk to that? As a matter of fact, whether you're talking about Victor Herbert or you're talking about Gilbert and Sullivan or you're talking about Janine, it's all it works as a piece so beautifully.
I appreciate that. That was I think our goal was, certainly when Dick and I started writing, what we wanted to do was, I think was achieved when someone said, "Oh, I loved I Turned the Corner from the movie. Thank God they kept it." And it's a new song. And, you know, yes, well, isn't it good? We're glad we kept it too. So it was, you know, I think wanted to, certainly I wanted to almost have an alter ego of someone who I could pretend that I wrote Mammy and the Gilbert and Sullivan and Jimmy and Thoroughly Modern Millie, and that was the assignment, was to just fulfill the obligation of the score as opposed to start with me. You know, if I were to write this from scratch, I would not have written it this way, just because I would not have started with material, you know, prefab material, but the material was fab. So it gave me a wonderful assignment in terms of, I think, what Mike was speaking about, the limitations. Sometimes when you have less money, your creativity expands. And I think for this, I just decided that I was going to take it to play a really great game of how could this be interwoven and that be using counterpoint. And I just threw out all the accompaniments, and then Dick and I, we probably wrote 40 songs that aren't on the stage.
Yeah.
In trying
big
to
old trunk, Lost in La Jolla will be our next CD.
That's right. And so I had a really great time just connecting the dots of the score and giving it a point of view, a unification. I learned so much from Ralph Burns, and we made a lot of decisions about what we would be inspired by and not try to make it dusty. And I think the difference between this and a 20s musical per se was that was much more tied at the time to vaudeville and to songs that didn't function to further story, and a lot of the songs that we have now are book songs that were written for it.
And when were they written, though? Are these, how much musical changes were there from La Jolla till opening night?
There are only 2 songs, there are only 2 Tesori Scanlon songs of the 9 that are in the Broadway production that existed in La Jolla. So we wrote 7 new songs between La Jolla and Broadway. I mean, we actually wrote more than 7, but there are 7 that exist. And then the sort of existing material, Mammy, Thoroughly Modern Millie, Jimmy, and I'm Falling in Love with Someone, that was in La Jolla. So the score...
They were in La Jolla?
Yes, they were.
Oh,
So I would say the score changed about 50% from La Jolla. We did substantial rewriting from La Jolla.
How did you decide to put those numbers in, the ones that you didn't create? How did you decide to put those in the first place? The Mammy, what made you decide to put those in?
It sort of, in a sense, it sort of happened backwards in that those songs, because Michael and I had started with a book that used existing material, we had all old songs, many of them with new lyrics, and one of the songs was Mammy. And I guess I'll just have to give away the twist on it, because in order to explain, the characters that sing Mammy, Ching Ho and Bun Fu, they perform the entire show in Chinese because they are immigrants and they are super titled. And so they sing Mammy in Chinese and they are super titled, and it's an extraordinarily funny sequence. And beyond that, Michael and I also think there's something really crazily subversive about it, because Mammy is the song that's so associated with racism, and to have it on stage in such a completely turned on its head way takes the onus off it, in a sense. And so we didn't want to lose that, even when we brought in, even when we became clearer and clearer that we wanted predominantly new music. Well, in a sense, in order to have Mammy there, you needed throughout the evening to have an occasional moment where there was an old song sort of sent up in a new way, so that when we arrived at Mammy near the end of the play, there was a precedent for it, rather than suddenly at 10:20 the rules changed. And we also had a title song called Thoroughly Modern Millie, which is familiar and beloved, and it seems silly to do without it. So I thought, well, here we already have 2. We have one at the beginning, one near the end. Let's pepper in just occasionally. There's really only 2 more in there, and that's sort of how it came to be.
I think it gives, you know, I met this, I think he was probably 75, this man, and when the character burst into a song that he knew, he started crying. Because it was for him, I think, you know, to me, the whole musical is about comfort and joy. And it's wonderful to be associated with this, and I think it hit younger people because there's new things that they think that they knew. Like we do a whole Tchaikovsky Nutcracker take on the 20s, and then this character bursts into song that this man knew and remembered from the time that it was new, and it hooked him in a different way. And that's the surprise of the show is that it's constantly surprising itself.
How many musicians are in the show now?
24.
24, right.
Including my husband. Yeah, my husband conducts it.
Well, and well, I must say.
Oh, tell him.
I'd like to know about previews. Who decides how many previews, and what's the purpose of it?
What's the purpose of previews?
Previews?
Well, you have to go back to the whole question about deciding whether or not we had an out-of-town before New York, because when we decided not to have an out-of-town, there was a discussion with the creative team about trying to have 4 weeks at least of previews.
And 6 weeks of rehearsal.
And 6 weeks of rehearsal.
And no Wednesday.
And no Wednesday.
No Wednesday
That was the
matinee.
most important thing, was not having a Wednesday matinee during
During the
previews.
preview.
So, we
So
could
that
rehearse.
they
work
wanted the
every
time to
day.
work
Tuesday,
on the
What
show.
did that cost, cutting out the matinee?
Well, you can say each show you have the potential to take in $100,000.
So theoretically, that $100,000, and you say it was well worth it because it delivered the product that you had.
It also didn't break the momentum of the week. They didn't come in on Tuesday, rehearse, and then
Do two
do
shows.
two shows Wednesday, and then rehearse again. You could build
Yes.
this
Because your
momentum
purpose
of
during the
change.
daytime and your purpose during the nighttime are slightly different, and so it doesn't break the momentum, as you said. What in the daytime it's to make people crazy and throw it all around. In the nighttime it's to perform it and to make it seem like nothing had changed.
I have to say during the preview time, because I don't know if everyone understands, you can work with the actors from 1 to 6 in the afternoon.
Right.
And then you do the show at night, so the actors are called at 7:30. The show is coming down close to 11 o'clock at night at that point. And then the
Which has since changed.
which has since
Just make that
changed,
clear.
now 10:30. And then the creative team would sit and give notes to all of the staff that worked the show that night of any technical problems or issues, because of course the show was going through this sort of tryout phase. And that would take until midnight at some point. And then the creative team would go and work
until 3.
until 2 or 3 in the morning to discuss what they needed to do the next day.
And then we'd get up and write.
Right. So it was an incredible, I mean, I
Right.
can't,
Right.
it's very, very grueling process.
That's what I was saying about the net, which I want to clarify. I think that the great thing about the chat rooms is the interest and the dialogue. The really hard thing that I'm trying to understand is when people publicly discuss what is not finished. And I think when we're all working on 3 or 4 hours of sleep and someone calls you with this really, really hellacious comments from the chat, you just think, you know what, it's just not fair. Wait till we open and then chat away and discuss away or discuss privately. But during that period when we're all working on fumes, it's really
Well, I have to
precious.
say, and even from our point of view, when we were discussing going out of town, not that this made or didn't make our decision, but there was the time when you went out of town and the press left you alone, and you were able to do your work, and you didn't have that buzz coming back to New York, so you came into New York fresh. There was a time that, believe it or not, you could do that. That's over.
Because
So-
of economics, you can't do that.
No, Isabel,
just the
because of the
economics.
internet, you can't do that. When we were in La Jolla, as far away from New York in the same country as you could possibly get, maybe Hawaii, we still had that, oh, I saw Millie, this isn't good, or that's great, or that's fabulous. And so one of the things the producers all talked about when we were discussing out of town before we came into New York was its purpose was to let these guys do their work in a sort of cocooned environment, and we realized that's never going to happen.
No.
Even if we went to Seattle or St. Paul or whatever, people were still going to be talking, and it would still get back into their little world, and we wouldn't have really accomplished what we would have wanted to, which is to let them work without having that kind of distraction. And
That's why we needed more time.
Well, there is a flip side to what you've been saying, though, and that is you're charging the same price for previews as you are for the regular, are you not? And so why should someone go to a preview and not feel free to get on the net and say what they thought if they paid the same price as someone who came in after the opening? I think you should explain that.
Well, you know what? I have to take a little exception with that because, yes, in theory, you do charge the same prices. But, we you know, I can't speak for every producer, but one of the things that we at Millie did was we had heavy discounts during previews. We sent out over 450,000 pieces of mail to theater goers and offered them tickets for $50 and $55, close to half price. We were always at the TKTS booth, so people could see a preview, you know, for half. We had student discounts. We had student rush. We, you know, and we
How do
made
we know about that?
Huh? Sorry?
How does one know about those tickets?
How does one know about those tickets? We made it, the student rush was anytime anybody asked at the box office, they were told. The TKTS booth is, you know, there, and we
The
were always
flyers were
there.
everywhere.
Flyers were everywhere.
No, our outreach for the direct mail was a huge direct mail mailing for 450
Before we
pieces.
wrap this up, would you just tell us where is the show? How is the show going to be sold out? What's the It's obviously a show for everybody.
Yes.
What's your thrust now in selling it? Before
Even
you
in
leave
terms
us?
of how you
Yes.
sell.
What's your plan?
Well, that's our thrust. I think what you just said, it's a show for everybody. And that is going to be the thrust of our campaign, that it is just sheer fun and joy, and everybody from 6 to 60, you know, can appreciate that. And
There's never enough time to find out as much as we want to about producing, but we have to cut now and say thank you so very much for being with us on the American Theatre Wing Seminar on Working the Theatre. Your production is wonderful, and we look forward to many more productions of it across the country, not
Yes.
only in New York.
thank you.
Thank you so
very
much.
much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bands are getting jazzier. Halfway